which saturated fats should you eat more of, and which saturated fats should you eat less of. Believe it or not, there are better and worse saturated fats. They're not just grouped into one simple category of saturated fats. So what I've done is I've divided this video into 4 categories, and they're the different kinds of saturated fats, but I'm gonna make sure that I give you the kinds of foods that are in those categories. So let's jump right into that. Okay, first we have what's called palmitic acid. Okay, palmitic acid is the saturated fat that you're normally gonna find in red meat. Okay, red meat is pretty rich in palmitic acid, so the saturated fat in like a juicy ribeye, something like that. Okay, also palm oil, hence palmitic acid. So palm oil, you see a good amount of palmitic acid. We'll talk about those foods. Okay, then we have myristic acid, which is another kind of saturated fat. Again, I'm gonna have to divide these into categories because how I break down the research. Now, myristic acid, you'll see a little bit in coconut oil. You'll see it in something weird that's called nutmeg butter because it's very high in it, but no one's really making nutmeg butter anymore. You'll see about like 7 to 15% depending on the brand, things like that, in butter fat. Okay, just regular good old butter. Okay, and the same kind of thing with cheese. Like you'll see it in a good amount of like hard cheeses and just regular cheeses. Not so much in like the goat cheeses, which I'll talk about in just a second as well. Then we have stearic acid. Now stearic acid, you're gonna be like other forms of meat, like pork, poultry, fish, cocoa butter, like chocolate, unsweetened chocolate, also heavy cream and some other forms of dairy, okay? So you kind of have this wide variety of stearic acid. There's a lot of foods with stearic acid. Then you have what is called lauric acid, which is really, in this case, MCT oil and coconut. So let's start with palmitic acid for just a second. The biggest issue that we really are facing in terms of at least the data with palmitic acid is it's so overconsumed. Like in the United States, 56% or so of the saturated fat that we consume here in the States is from palmitic acid. So we consume this like disproportional amount of palmitic acid compared to the other saturated fats. But anyhow, let's break down some of the research with it. So the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition had published this paper that took a look at 60 studies. Okay, and when they look at the total cholesterol ratio to LDL ratio, they find that, okay, LDL seems to drive up like disproportionately with palmitic acid. So there's some pretty good link there because that's a lot of data they're looking at, 60 different studies. It doesn't mean that saturated fats are bad from red meat. It just means like, okay, in this case, we're seeing a pretty large driver of LDL going up. Okay, well, let's look at more data though. They also found that something called apolipoprotein B. Now, apolipoprotein B is the main protein that makes up LDL cholesterol. They found that this apolipoprotein B went up with palmitic acid consumption, but went down with stearic. So that's just a perfect indicator that like 2 saturated fats that most people would group together in one category do 2 totally different things when it comes down to the protein that really makes up LDL cholesterol. So that's pretty wild. Then there was another study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This one looked at 2 different diets that had additional like high levels of palmitic acid and diets that had higher levels of oleic acid. Now, oleic acid is not a saturated fat, so I understand this is not necessarily apples to apples. This really is apples to oranges, but it's still very interesting data, and sort of the follow-up that the research found is really interesting. So what they found in this study is that physical activity in the palmitic acid group went down quite a bit. Okay, and it was also found that there was more resting energy expenditure by 3.75% or so in the high oleic group. Okay, so what that was demonstrating was that the oleic acid group was burning more calories, burning more energy than the palmitic acid group. Well, that could mean a number of things because oleic acid has some benefits there, but palmitic acid was potentially, let's just, for lack of a better term, slowing down the metabolism and decreasing physical activity. Well, what's the mechanism there? Well, researchers hypothesize that it could have something to do with what's called ceramide. Now, ceramide, which can increase when we consume palmitic acid, interacts with the electron transport chain. So when we're producing energy, it can interact with the whole process during what's called complex 3, and that can create more reactive oxygen species. More reactive oxygen species indicates that we have like sort of a dysfunctional mitochondria situation going on. We have dysfunctional energy manufacturing. So that explains kind of that dysfunction and that dysregulation there, which could mean less physical activity and less resting energy expenditure. Okay, next up, I want to look at lauric acid and medium chain fats, which are so common on keto, coconut oil, MCT oil, okay? There is a really interesting study that I want to break down. This one was published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. It was a meta-analysis looking at 13 different studies. And it's really trying to break down, okay, if we look at people that have a lot of saturated fats versus people that had more MCT and medium chain fats and lauric acid, what does it really look like? Well, found that if people were to really sub out more of their saturated fats for medium chain triglycerides and stuff like that, well, there was not only a weight reduction of about 0.5 kilogram, but there was also a 1.46 centimeter reduction in waist circumference, a significant reduction in visceral fat as well. So this isn't like super hard data. It's a little bit subjective, but it is showing that if you're doing keto and you kind of swap out some of maybe the, I don't know, red meat fats, and you swap out some of the other, like even dairy fats occasionally with more coconut oil and more MCT oil, there could be a positive metabolic effect. If you look at the chart that's on the screen right now, which we're going to come back to and talk about again when we talk about a different fat, you'll see that the lauric acid doesn't really contribute too much to overall cholesterol levels. It's kind of neutral. So in that case, it's kind of like middle of the road, right? Palmitic, we kind of want to neutralize and bring down a little bit. But I think with coconut oil, stuff like that, we're fine. We can probably like substitute some of those fats with coconut oil. With MCTs, you can use either straight MCT oil, or I typically like to use like an MCT powder, because that way I can just add it to coffee and things like that. So my recommended one, there's one down below I put, it's called Perfect Keto. So Perfect Keto makes all kinds of different MCT flavors. They have vanilla, they have unflavored, they have chocolate, they have strawberry, which kind of tastes like Nesquik. It's awesome. Anyway, they're a big sponsor on this channel. So if you're looking to add some MCT oil, I would definitely recommend that you try their MCT powder. It is so delicious, and if you add it to coffee, it's just like, oh my gosh, it just takes coffee to the next level. So anyway, I put a link down below, that way you can save a few bucks. So that link will get you a special discount on Perfect Keto powdered MCT, either unflavored or whatever flavor you want. So again, big thank you to Perfect Keto for the continued support on this channel as well, and definitely check them out so you can claim that discount. Now let's move into Myristic, which is another, what I don't know, just call it kind of a neutral fat. It's really not super good, it's also not super bad. It's not providing a whole lot of benefit though. Now remember, Myristic is going to be in butterfat, it's going to be in cheeses, nutmeg, things like that, okay? Now, the interesting thing about Myristic is it does drive up total cholesterol. Okay, we do see an increase in total cholesterol, but we don't see necessarily a huge increase in LDL proportionally. So although it drives up total cholesterol, it seems to be driving up both HDL and LDL, which may or may not be a huge problem, really. So if you look at the chart that's on the screen, this comes from a study that was published in arteriosclerosis and thrombosis. Now, it's wild because you look at this, you see Myristic acid increases cholesterol levels 1.5 times more than palmitic, okay? But then when you look at stearic acid potentially brings down cholesterol levels, and then once again, of course, we come back to the lauric that's just kind of not doing a whole lot. So we see an increase in LDL, but we're also seeing that increase in HDL too. So we're seeing kind of just total cholesterol going up, but we're not necessarily seeing LDL go up disproportionately like we would with, say, palmitic. So what does that tell us about Myristic? It kind of puts us back in that category, right? So right now we have palmitic, where we should probably try to reduce. Possibly even if you're doing keto, maybe reduce red meat a little bit, swap it out with some chicken thigh, chocolate, you know, swap it out a little bit. Myristic, coming from like the butter and stuff like that, don't go overboard on it. Have little bits of it now and then. Coconut oil, MCT, I think you're good to go. It's really not going to impact you negatively, and there's potentially a good benefit that you get there. Again, so even things like goat cheese, which is rich in MCTs as well. Now the one I really want to talk about, the one that's really good, stearic acid. So literally eating unsweetened chocolate, cocoa butter, cocoa mass, these things are good. Even heavy cream. These are saturated fats that have some benefits. So let me talk about this really quick, and I don't want to bore you. I know you just want to get right into the heavy cream, but check this out. There was a study that was published in the journal PLOS1. It was done on mice, so full disclaimer, it was done on mice. But this study took a look at 40 mice, and it divided them into 4 groups, okay? Either gave them a stearic acid-rich diet, it gave them a low-fat diet, or it gave them a safflower oil-rich diet, or a corn oil-rich diet. Now, after this was all done, they found that the stearic acid triggered a 40% reduction in visceral fat with these mice. That's pretty unreal. So what the heck is the mechanism there? How is stearic acid potentially reducing visceral fat, the potbelly fat? Well, what they're finding is that stearic acid may promote apoptosis and cytotoxicity of what are called pre-adipocytes. So pre-adipocytes are like things that are going to turn into fat cells once they get, let's call it, activated. Okay, so what's interesting is stearic acid seemed to increase the apoptosis, the premature cell death, the cell death of these pre-fat cells. This is super intriguing. Okay, so in our visceral fat, we have a particular protein, and this protein normally blocks the cell death of the pre-fat cell. So when we block the cell death of a pre-fat cell, think about it. That pre-fat cell is never dying or not dying that much. So we have more of them available to gain fat. So visceral fat can grow very fast. But stearic acid, at least in this mice study, seems to stop that protein and make it so that the cells can actually go through their natural cycle of dying. Okay, so if they go through apoptosis, then they're not turning into an actual mature fat cell in the adipose tissue, particularly with the visceral fat. That is what's fascinating. Now, can that be translated into humans? Potentially, but I mean, this study right now is just mice. Another thing we have to look at is there's a study that was published in the journal Nature Communications that shows that stearic acid could play a role in like mitochondrial regulation. Okay, so this is fascinating because they put subjects on a 2-day vegan diet, low-fat vegan diet. And at the end of 2 days, they gave people a shake, a banana shake. One banana shake had nothing else in it. One banana shake added stearic acid. Okay, the stearic acid group ended up having more mitochondrial fusion a few hours after drinking the shake. What that tells us is mitochondrial fusion is critical for the mitochondria to do its job right. Basically, mitochondria will also ultimately like fuse different components of one another into one to borrow resources from another. So it's very important for our bodies to produce energy properly. And it looks like stearic acid plays a positive role in this. Additionally, there were lower levels of circulating carnitine, which tells us that more carnitine was probably being used to transport fat, which tells us that potentially stearic acid improves fatty acid oxidation, improves potential fat burning. So with all of this, it seems like the saturated fat that we want to lean into the most is going to be the stearic acid. Again, the poultry, the fish, even the occasional like chicken thigh would probably be okay in this particular case. Heavy cream and chocolate that is unsweetened, of course, and cocoa butter. These kinds of things, the stearic acid rich foods, seem to have positive effects on visceral fat. They don't seem to have a huge effect when it comes down to total cholesterol levels or LDL cholesterol levels. There's additional benefits, and just overall, the research is pretty interesting. But at the end of the day, I think if you just reduce palmitic a little bit and replace it with the other three, you'll probably be in a better spot. But either way, as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.